So I don't think I'm overselling this video when I say that if you haven't learned about APIs before, this is the most powerful technique that you're going to learn in programming. An API stands for Application Programming Interface. And essentially, it's a programmatic way to be able to access functions and data from other apps. That might not sound like much, but when you couple it with the fact that pretty much every major platform has an API, most of which are free, and you can access them to work with maps and location. You can use Facebook or Twitter and all the data that they have. You can even get data from NASA via APIs. So it allows you to access huge amounts of data and build apps that rely on existing systems like Facebook and Twitter. We're going to be starting our API journey with a nice and simple API, the Open Weather Map API, which, like most APIs, is freely available and very powerful. It's also handy for us because it's a nice comparison to the What's the Weather app that we made a couple of sections ago. And we made that by scraping HTML data and processing it to extract the data that we need. Now that worked for us, but it's not a great solution because we're at the mercy of the website. And if they change their HTML or their URLs or something like that, then our app will stop working. So the alternative is to use an API which is actually designed to be used in this way. And that's what we're going to do in this video. So enough talking, let's get started and you'll see very quickly what this API is and how it works. So with Open Weather Map, you need to create an account. So click sign up and I'm going to use Rob3139 and rob@codestars.com. Tick the box, create an account, and I'm just going to cancel that. And there you go, you're in. And once you have an account, the main important thing that you're going to need is an API key. So if you click API keys, this is my API key. So when you go to Open Weather Map, you'll get your own one of these. So I'd select it and copy it to the clipboard because you'll need it very shortly. Then jump over to API. I'm going to use Command click to open that in a new tab. And we're going to focus on the current weather data API. If later on you want to build some other sort of weather app that involves air pollution or UV index or something like that, then you can. But we're going to essentially recreate what we had with the What's the Weather app, but doing it properly with APIs. So let's click on the API doc. So if you want to, pause the video and spend a bit of time reading that. But essentially the short outcome is that if we click on one of these links here, it will give us the weather that we want. But it will only give us the weather that we want if we put in our app ID. So replace this big long app ID with your own and then press enter and you should get something that looks like this. So this might not look as friendly, even as friendly as an HTML document, but actually it's a lot more powerful. This is what's known as JSON or JavaScript Object Notation. It's designed to simply store data in a plain text format, and almost every programming language, Swift included, has functions built in to process JSON and extract this data. So let's see how we do it. I'm going to copy this URL because this is our key to the Open Weather Map API. And I'm going to start off another project. Single view application. I'm going to call it API demo and save it on the desktop. Okay, so we're going to do everything in viewcontroller.swift, and the place to begin is to create a URL in the usual way from a string, and the string is that URL that we just copied with your app ID at the end. Now, you may notice that that's HTTP. I would be surprised if we couldn't do this over HTTPS. Oh, we can't. Okay. So that means we'll need to edit our info.plist and allow that domain name. I'm going to show you a shortcut way to do it. You can just do a quick Google of something like access HTTP websites Swift transport security, and that should get you a result involving transport security blocking an HTTP connection, and then scroll down until you find a solution in plain text. And here we go. So that just saves you having to remember the precise names of everything every time. And then we can open our info.plist file as source code, as we've done before, and then just paste in the plain text. And let's get the server name correct. So this is openweathermap.org. And we're going to allow subdomains. We're going to allow HTTP loads, and we don't need to specify a minimum TLS version. There we go. So that should allow us to get the content of that URL. Just for a change, I'm going to show you how to create a task from a URL, which avoids having to create a request. It's just another way of doing it, really. So let's create our task. So as usual, it's going to be URL session, shared session, and data task, but this time data task with URL, and bring that completion handler in there as well, because then we can double click on that and it will give us the variables that we need. So URL is obviously the variable that we need for the URL, and then we've got data, response, and error, and we're going to be using them in this code. And I do need to unwrap the URL there. I'll do it at this point. Again, I've put in this URL so I know that it's valid. So we'll do a quick check for error not being nil. And if it is, we'll get the URL content by creating a new variable and putting it equal to the optional data. And if we've got some data, then we'll have the variable URL content. Now this URL content is going to be JSON, so we can process the JSON and get a JSON result. And we do that using JSON serialization .json object with data, and the data is of course URL content, and options. The one option that you'll need is JSON serialization .reading options .mutable containers. And I'd just recommend having that as the default option. It means that we can change them later if we want to. And then we'll just print JSON result. Now, JSON serialization is something that can go wrong if your data is malformed. So if it's not proper JSON. So we need to surround this with a do and try and a catch. So if we get to there, we'll say JSON processing failed. And we need to add the try just before the method that is risky. So in this case, JSON serialization.json object. And fortunately, that has reminded me that I, as usual, have forgotten to start my task with task resume. All right then, let's give this a try. So most of this code is familiar. We're just getting the URL, creating a task from the URL this time to go and get the content of that URL, checking for an error, and if there isn't one, checking that we can get the data, and if we can, then processing it from JSON to an array that we can deal with in a usual Swift manner. So let's have a look. With any luck, we'll see our array appear in the console shortly. And here we go. Let's have a good look. And there is our data. So we can access that in the usual way. Essentially, each of these can be considered either variables like that or dictionaries like that. So if we want to get the name, for example, that's probably the simplest, or indeed the ID, we can just print JSON result name. So let's just quickly run that, make sure that works for us. And there we go. You can see we've got London there. It is, of course, an optional. We'd need to check for its existence before we used it. Now, getting this weather description, icon, ID, and main, though, is a little bit more complicated. There are a number of ways to do it, but I think the simplest, if we want to extract the description, for example, would be to create a variable called description and set that equal to JSON result weather, and then 0, because this is considered an array with just one object in it, and that object is essentially a dictionary from which we can grab the description. And then if that's successful, we can print the description. Now we do have to add in 2 question marks there though. Otherwise you end up with an error saying that JSON result weather is an optional. And there we go. You can see we've now got that description in there. So it's a slightly convoluted way around to get the description, but we got there. So the challenge now then, which you may have seen coming, is to rebuild the What's the Weather app using this API. So the functionality should all be largely the same. Don't worry too much about layout, background images, that kind of thing. But the main thing is to realize that we can have an app which works via HTML scraping, or much better, an app that works via an API. So you can use this code as a starting point. Best of luck. Okay, I hope that went well. I'm going to start by quickly recreating the UI from our What's the Weather app. So I'm going to first drag in our background image, copying it in as usual, and then we'll jump over to main storyboard and let's add in our What's the Weather user interface. So we'll start with a title label at the top. What's the weather? We'll make that a little bit bigger. Let's go for 25. And center it. There we go. Then the instruction to enter your city. Again, we'll center that. Then we'll have our text field, just as before. And we'll add a placeholder, e.g. London, San Francisco. We'll have our button to submit. And finally, we'll have our result label, which I'll stretch out to the edges of the screen, give it a bit more room, and make it centered. There we go. I won't bother with auto layout this time as we did that before, but I will bring in our nice background image. Notice that this time I'm bringing the background image in after everything else. Which could be a problem because it might appear on top of everything else. But I'll show you an easy way to stop that from happening. We just bring in our scene view over here, and then we drag the image view to the top of the view list. And that will just make the image view be at the background of everything else. Okay, and then let's bring in our background.jpg image. And I forget which one we used in the end. That looks pretty good. Yeah, that'll work. And for now, all I'm going to do is update my code so that instead of printing the description, it will display it on that label, the result label. And then all that remains is to allow the user to enter their own city and search for that instead. So let's create some outlets while we're here. We're going to need the text field. So I'll drag that in, control drag. I'll call it city text field. We're going to need an action for our button. I'll just call it submit. And we're going to need an outlet for our result label as well. Try that again. Control drag. We'll call that result label. Super. So all we want to do here then is, instead of printing the description, we want to display it in the result label. But remember that when we do that, we need to dispatch the queue to avoid having to wait. So let's enter the code to do that. Dispatch queue. And the queue we want to dispatch is the main queue. And we're going to sync. And we want to execute the following code. And the code that we want to execute is just to update that label. So self to get the view controller, and then result label, and we want to set the text of that to description. And that gives us an error because our description is of type any object rather than string, but that's easily fixed. We can just attempt to cast it to a string when we define it. And we're pretty confident that's going to work. But if it doesn't, then we won't get a crash. We just won't get a result here. Okay, so we should now have something that looks the same as our previous What's the Weather app and displays the weather in London in the result area. And there we go. So that's working great. We just need to make it work with the user entry. So that should be fairly straightforward. We're going to take all our code from view.did.load and copy it over into the button action. There we go. And as before, all we need to change here is to change London to being the entry in the text field. So that'll be city text field dot text. And we'll need to force unwrap that, which is fine. City.textfield.text might be empty, but it will definitely be a string. While we're here though, I will change that to an if let, and then do all of this only if we are able to create a URL. And if we're not, let's add an error message. So just result label.text. Couldn't find weather for that city. Please try another. So fairly generic error message. Okay, so let's give that a try. So we should now find that we're able to enter a city and it will find the weather for that city. And here we go. So let's try Paris as our city and then tap submit. And we should get the weather for Paris. And there we go. No great surprise. It's pretty similar to here. All right, so all that remains then is to allow place names with spaces in, as we saw before. And to see how to do that, I'm going to take the URL string, copy it, and paste it into Chrome with, first off, just London as the city, and that should return the weather for London. There it is. And then I'm going to see what happens if I put in San Francisco with a space. Aha, and you can see now we've got the weather and it's put in a %20. Now this is an HTML character code for a space. So all we need to do is replace the spaces in our string with %20s, and that should give us the result that we want. So back over to Xcode. We hopefully remember that we can do that using replace occurrences of string with string, and we want to replace spaces with the HTML symbol %20. There we go. So if we just check that out, we should now find that we can enter city names like San Francisco and find the weather there. It's worth noting that, as before, there's a fair bit more error checking that we could do if we wanted, but I'm going to leave it as is. That should show us enough information. And here we go. So I'm going to enter San Francisco and submit. Let's see what we get. Aha, we've got that classic San Francisco weather, mist. Wonderful. So what you could do if you wanted to take this app further is extract more of the weather details. So at the moment, we've just got the description there, but you could add in sunrise and sunset times, temperatures, pressures, etc. But really, the main thing that I wanted to show you was that we could take the What's the Weather app, and instead of using HTML web scraping, we can use an API. And this is a much better way to do it because we're not at the mercy of the website creators who may change their HTML and then break our app. Alright then, so we're now finally ready to build our blog reader app, and that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video.